Part 2. Closing Day. Chapter 8. A View of the Overlook. Mommy was worried. She was afraid the bug wouldn't make it up and down all these mountains, and that they would get stranded by the side of the road where somebody might come ripping along and hit them. Danny himself was more sanguine. If Daddy thought the bug would make it this one last trip, then it probably would. "We're just about there," Jack said. Wendy brushed her hair back from her temples. Thank God. She was sitting in the right-hand bucket, a Victoria Holt paperback open but face down in her lap. She was wearing her blue dress, the one Daddy thought was her prettiest. It had a sailor collar and made her look very young, like a girl just getting ready to graduate from high school. Daddy kept putting his hand high up on her leg, and she kept laughing and brushing it off, saying, "Get away, fly." Danny was impressed with the mountains. One day, Daddy had taken them up in the ones near Boulder, the ones they called the Flatirons, but these were much bigger. And on the tallest of them, you could see a fine dusting of snow, which Daddy said was often there year-round. And they were actually in the mountains, no goofing around. Sheer rock faces rose all around them, so high you could barely see their tops, even by craning your neck out the window. When they left Boulder, the temperature had been in the high 70s. Now, just after noon, the air up here felt crisp and cold like November back in Vermont, and Daddy had the heater going. Not that it worked all that well. They had passed several signs that said Falling Rock Zone. Mommy read each one to him. And although Danny had waited anxiously to see some rock fall, none had. At least not yet. Half an hour ago, they had passed another sign that Daddy said was very important. The sign said, "Entering Sidewinder Pass." And Daddy said that sign was as far as the snowplows went in the wintertime. After that, the road got too steep. In the winter, the road was closed from the little town of Sidewinder, which they had gone through just before they got to that sign, all the way to Buckland, Utah. Now they were passing another sign. "What's that one, Mom?" "That one says, slower vehicles use right lane. That means us." "The bug will make it," Danny said. "Please, God," Mommy said, and crossed her fingers. Danny looked down at her open-toed sandals and saw that she had crossed her toes as well. He giggled. She smiled back, but he knew that she was still worried. The road wound up and up in a series of slow S-curves, and Jack dropped the bug's stick shift from 4th gear to 3rd, then into 2nd. The bug wheezed and protested, and Wendy's eyes fixed on the speedometer needle, which sank from 40 to 30 to 20, where it hovered reluctantly. "The fuel pump," she began timidly. "The fuel pump will go another 3 miles, Jack said shortly. The rock wall fell away to their right, disclosing a slash valley that seemed to go down forever, lined in a dark green with Rocky Mountain pine and spruce. The pines fell away to gray cliffs of rock that dropped for hundreds of feet before smoothing out. She saw a waterfall spilling over one of them, the early afternoon sun sparkling in it like a golden fish snared in a blue net. They were beautiful mountains, but they were hard. She did not think they would forgive many mistakes. An unhappy foreboding rose in her throat. Further west in the Sierra Nevada, the Donner Party had become snowbound and had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. The mountains did not forgive many mistakes. With a punch of the clutch and a jerk, Jack shifted down to 1st gear, and they labored upward, the bug's engine thumping gamely. "You know," she said, "I don't think I've seen 5 cars since we came through Sidewinder, and one of them was the hotel limousine." Jack nodded. "It goes right to Stapleton Airport in Denver. There's already some icy patches up beyond the hotel, Watson says, and they're forecasting more snow for tomorrow up higher. Anybody going through the mountains now wants to be on one of the main roads, just in case. That goddamn Ullman better still be up there. I guess he will be." "You're sure the larder is fully stocked?" she asked, still thinking of the Donners. "He said so. He wanted Halloran to go over it with you. Halloran's the cook." "Oh," she said faintly, looking at the speedometer. It had dropped from 15 to 10 miles an hour. "There's the top," Jack said, pointing 300 yards ahead. "There's a scenic turnout. You can see the overlook from there. I'm going to pull off the road and give the bug a chance to rest." He craned over his shoulder at Danny, who was sitting on a pile of blankets. "What do you think, Doc? We might see some deer, or caribou." "Sure, Dad." The VW labored up and up. The speedometer dropped to just above the 5-mile-an-hour hash mark, and was beginning to hitch when Jack pulled off the road. "What's that sign, Mommy?" "Scenic turnout," she read dutifully, and stepped on the emergency brake and let the VW run in neutral. "Come on," he said, and got out. They walked to the guardrail together. "That's it," Jack said, and pointed at 11 o'clock. For Wendy, it was discovering truth in a cliché. Her breath was taken away. For a moment, she was unable to breathe at all. The view had knocked the wind from her. They were standing near the top of one peak. Across from them, who knew how far, an even taller mountain reared into the sky. Its jagged tip only a silhouette. That was now nimbused by the sun, which was beginning its decline. The whole valley floor was spread out below them, the slopes that they had climbed in the laboring bug falling away with such dizzying suddenness that she knew to look down there for too long would bring on nausea and eventual vomiting. The imagination seemed to spring to full life in the clear air beyond the reign of reason, and to look was to helplessly see oneself plunging down and down and down, sky and slopes changing places in slow cartwheels, the scream drifting from your mouth like a lazy balloon as your hair and your dress billowed out. She jerked her gaze away from the drop almost by force and followed Jack's finger. She could see the highway clinging to the side of its cathedral spire, switching back on itself, but always tending northwest. Still climbing, but at a more gentle angle. Further up, seemingly set directly in the slope itself, she saw the grimly clinging pines give way to a wide square of green lawn, and standing in the middle of it, overlooking all this, the hotel, the Overlook. Seeing it, she found breath and voice again. "Oh, Jack, it's gorgeous." "Yes, it is," he said. "Ullman says he thinks it's the single most beautiful location in America. I don't care much for him, but I think he might be—" "Danny! Danny, are you all right?" She looked around for him, and her sudden fear for him blotted out everything else, stupendous or not. She darted toward him. He was holding on the guardrail and looking at the hotel, his face a pasty gray color. His eyes had the blank look of someone on the verge of fainting. She knelt beside him and put steadying hands on his shoulders. "Danny, what's—" Jack was beside her. "You okay, Doc?" He gave Danny a brisk little shake and his eyes cleared. "I'm okay, Daddy. I'm fine." "What was it, Danny?" she asked. "Were you dizzy, honey?" "No, I was just thinking. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you." He looked at his parents, kneeling in front of him, and offered them a small, puzzled smile. "Maybe it was the sun. The sun got in my eyes." "We'll get you up to the hotel and give you a drink of water," Daddy said. "Okay." And in the bug, which moved upward more surely on the gentler grade, he kept looking out between them as the road unwound, affording occasional glimpses of the Overlook Hotel, its massive bank of westward-looking windows reflecting back the sun. It was the place he had seen in the midst of the blizzard, the dark and booming place where some hideously familiar figures sought him, down long corridors, carpeted with jungle. The place Tony had warned him against. It was here. It was here. Whatever red rum was, it was here. Chapter 9. Checking It Out. Ullman was waiting for them just inside the wide, old-fashioned front doors. He shook hands with Jack and nodded coolly at Wendy, perhaps noticing the way heads turned when she came through into the lobby, her golden hair spilling across the shoulders of the simple navy dress. The hem of the dress stopped at a modest 2 inches above the knee, but you didn't have to see more to know they were good legs. Ullman seemed truly warm toward Danny only, but Wendy had experienced that before. Danny seemed to be a child for people who ordinarily held W.C. Fields sentiments about children. He bent a little from the waist and offered Danny his hand. Danny shook it formally without a smile. "My son Danny," Jack said, "and my wife, Winifred." "I'm happy to meet you both," Ullman said. "How old are you, Danny?" 5, sir." "Sir, yet." Ullman smiled and glanced at Jack. "He's well-mannered." "Of course he is," Jack said. "And Mrs. Torrance." He offered the same little bow, and for a bemused instant Wendy thought he would kiss her hand. She half offered it, and he did take it, but only for a moment, clasped in both of his. His hands were small and dry and smooth, and she guessed that he powdered them. The lobby was a bustle of activity. Almost every one of the old-fashioned high-backed chairs was taken. Bellboys shuffled in and out with suitcases, and there was a line at the desk, which was dominated by a huge brass cash register. The Bank America card and master charge decals on it seemed jarringly anachronistic. To their right, down toward a pair of tall double doors, that were pulled closed and roped off, there was an old-fashioned fireplace, now blazing with birch logs. 3 nuns sat on a sofa that was drawn up almost to the hearth itself. They were talking and smiling with their bags stacked up to either side, waiting for the checkout line to thin a little. As Wendy watched them, they burst into a chord of tinkling, girlish laughter. She felt a smile touch her own lips. Not one of them could be under 60. In the background was the constant hum of conversation, the muted ding of the silver-plated bell beside the cash register, as one of the 2 clerks on duty struck it. The slightly impatient call of, "Front, please!" It brought back strong, warm memories of her honeymoon in New York with Jack at the Beekman Tower. For the first time, she let herself believe that this might be exactly what the 3 of them needed, a season together, away from the world, a sort of family honeymoon. She smiled affectionately down at Danny, who was goggling around frankly at everything. Another limo, as gray as a banker's vest, had pulled up front. "The last day of the season," Ullman was saying. "Closing day. Always hectic. I'd expected you more around 3, Mr. Torrance." "I wanted to give the Volks time for a nervous breakdown if it decided to have one," Jack said. "It didn't." "How fortunate," Ullman said. "I'd like to take the 3 of you on a tour of the place a little later, and of course Dick Halloran wants to show Mrs. Torrance the Overlook's kitchen. But I'm afraid—" One of the clerks came over and almost tugged his forelock. "Excuse me, Mr. Ullman?" "Well, what is it?" "It's Mrs. Brandt," the clerk said uncomfortably. "She refuses to pay her bill with anything but her American Express card. I told her we stopped taking American Express at the end of the season last year, but she won't—" His eyes shifted to the Torrance family, then back to Ullman. He shrugged. "I'll take care of it." "Thank you, Mr. Ullman." The clerk crossed back to the desk, where a dreadnought of a woman, bundled into a long fur coat and what looked like a black feather boa, was remonstrating loudly. "I've been coming to the Overlook Hotel since 1955, she was telling the smiling, shrugging clerk. "I continued to come even after my second husband died of a stroke on that tiresome Roque Court. I told him the sun was too hot that day, and I have never, I repeat, never paid with anything but my American Express credit card. Call the police if you like. Have them drag me away. I will still refuse to pay with anything but my American Express credit card. I repeat." "Excuse me," Mr. Ullman said. They watched him cross the lobby, touch Mrs. Brandt's elbow deferentially, and spread his hands and nod when she turned her tirade on him. He listened sympathetically, nodded again, and said something in return. Mrs. Brandt smiled triumphantly, turned to the unhappy desk clerk, and said loudly, "Thank God there's one employee in this hotel who hasn't become an utter Philistine." She allowed Ullman, who barely came to the bulky shoulder of her fur coat, to take her arm and lead her away, presumably to his inner office. "Whew," Wendy said, smiling. "There's a dude who earns his money." "But he didn't like that lady," Danny said immediately. "He was just pretending to like her." Jack grinned down at him. "I'm sure that's true, Doc, but flattery is the stuff that greases the wheels of the world." "What's flattery?" "Flattery," Wendy told him, "is when your daddy says he likes my new yellow slacks, even if he doesn't, or when he says I don't need to take off 5 pounds. "Oh, is it lying for fun?" "Something very like that." He had been looking at her closely and now said, "You're pretty, Mommy." He frowned in confusion when they exchanged a glance and then burst into laughter. "Ullman didn't waste much flattery on me," Jack said. "Come on over by the window, you guys. I feel conspicuous standing out here in the middle with my denim jacket on. I honest to God didn't think there'd be anybody much here on closing day. Guess I was wrong." "You look very handsome," she said, and then they laughed again, Wendy putting a hand over her mouth. Danny still didn't understand, but it was okay. They were loving each other. Danny thought this place reminded her of somewhere else. The Beekman place, where she had been happy. He wished he liked it as well as she did, but he kept telling himself over and over that the things Tony showed him didn't always come true. He would be careful. He would watch for something called red rum, but he would not say anything unless he absolutely had to. Because they were happy. They had been laughing, and there were no bad thoughts. "Look at this view," Jack said. "Oh, it's gorgeous. Danny, look!" But Danny didn't think it was particularly gorgeous. He didn't like heights. They made him dizzy. Beyond the wide front porch, which ran the length of the hotel, a beautifully manicured lawn, there was a putting green on the right, sloped away to a long rectangular swimming pool. A "closed" sign stood on a little tripod at the end of the pool. "Closed" was one sign he could read by himself, along with "stop," "exit," "pizza," and a few others. Beyond the pool, a graveled path wound off through baby pines and spruces and aspens. Here was a small sign he didn't know. Roque. There was an arrow below it. "What's Roque, Daddy?" "A game," Daddy said. "It's a little bit like croquet, only you play it on a gravel court that has sides like a big billiard table instead of grass. It's a very old game, Danny. Sometimes they have tournaments here." "Do you play it with a croquet mallet?" "Like that," Jack agreed, "only the handle's a little shorter, and the head has two sides. One side is hard rubber, and the other side is wood." "Come out, you little shit. It's pronounced Roque," Daddy was saying. "I'll teach you how to play if you want." "Maybe," Danny said in an odd, colorless little voice that made his parents exchange a puzzled look over his head. "I might not like it, though." "Well, if you don't like it, Doc, you don't have to play, all right?" "Sure." "Do you like the animals?" Wendy asked. "That's called a topiary." Beyond the path leading to Roque, there were hedges clipped into the shapes of various animals. Danny, whose eyes were sharp, made out a rabbit, a dog, a horse, a cow, and a trio of bigger ones that looked like frolicking lions. "Those animals were what made Uncle Al think of me for the job," Jack told him. "He knew that when I was in college I used to work for a landscaping company. That's a business that fixes people's lawns and bushes and hedges. I used to trim a lady's topiary." Wendy put a hand over her mouth and snickered. Looking at her, Jack said, "Yes, I used to trim her topiary at least once a week." "Get away, Fly," Wendy said, and snickered again. "Did she have nice hedges, Dad?" Danny asked, and at this they both stifled great bursts of laughter. Wendy laughed so hard that tears streamed down her cheeks, and she had to get a Kleenex out of her handbag. "They weren't animals, Danny," Jack said when he had control of himself. "They were playing cards, spades and hearts and clubs and diamonds. But the hedges grow, you see." "They creep," Watson had said. "No, not the hedges, the boiler. You have to watch it at all times or you and your family will end up on the fucking moon." They looked at him puzzled. The smile had faded off his face. "Dad?" Danny asked. He blinked at them, as if coming back from far away. "They grow, Danny, and lose their shape, so I'll have to give them a haircut once or twice a week until it gets so cold they stop growing for the year." "And a playground, too," Wendy said. "My lucky boy." The playground was beyond the topiary. 2 slides, a big swing set with half a dozen swings set at varying heights, a jungle gym, a tunnel made of cement rings, a sandbox, and a playhouse that was an exact replica of the Overlook itself. "Do you like it, Danny?" Wendy asked. "I sure do," he said, hoping he sounded more enthused than he felt. "It's neat." Beyond the playground, there was an inconspicuous chain-link security fence. Beyond that, the wide, macadamized drive that led up to the hotel. And beyond that, the valley itself, dropping away into the bright blue haze of afternoon. Danny didn't know the word isolation, but if someone had explained it to him, he would have seized on it. Far below, lying in the sun, like a long black snake that had decided to snooze for a while, was the road that led back through Sidewinder Pass, and eventually to Boulder. The road that would be closed all winter long. He felt a little suffocated at the thought. and almost jumped when Daddy dropped his hand on his shoulder. "I'll get you that drink as soon as I can, Doc. They're a little busy right now." "Sure, Dad." Mrs. Brandt came out of the inner office looking vindicated. A few moments later, 2 bellboys, struggling with 8 suitcases between them, followed her as best they could as she strode triumphantly out the door. Danny watched through the window as a man in a gray uniform and a hat, like a captain in the army, brought her long silver car around to the door and got out. He tipped his cap to her and ran around to open the trunk, and in one of those flashes that sometimes came, he got a complete thought from her, one that floated above the confused, low-pitched babble of emotions and colors that he usually got in crowded places. "I'd like to get into his pants." Danny's brow wrinkled as he watched the bellboys put her cases into the trunk. She was looking rather sharply at the man in the gray uniform who was supervising the loading. Why would she want to get that man's pants? Was she cold, even with that long fur coat on? And if she was that cold, why hadn't she just put on some pants of her own? His mommy wore pants just about all winter. The man in the gray uniform closed the trunk and walked back to help her into the car. Danny watched closely to see if she would say anything about his pants, but she only smiled and gave him a $1 bill, a tip. A moment later, she was guiding the big silver car down the driveway. He thought about asking his mother why Mrs. Brandt might want the car man's pants and decided against it. Sometimes questions could get you in a whole lot of trouble, and it had happened to him before. So instead, he squeezed in between them on the small sofa they were sharing and watched all the people check out at the desk. He was glad his mommy and daddy were happy and loving each other, but he couldn't help being a little worried. He couldn't help it.